Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation program. I'm Jan Gibson, Vice President of Programs, and I sure wish you folks would sign up rather than just walk in. Thank you for those who signed up, and we love having you at our programs. I'd like to just say one thing before we start, and that's we have our holiday party at a historic Howard Van Doren Shaw home, and it's December 6th, so it's for members only, and we hope that you can make it. And we have lots of exciting programs about exploring our neighborhoods this next year. So there'll be little enclaves that we will visit, and you will get to see great architecture. With that, we are here today to celebrate one of our own hometown heroes. It's not every day that we have a local, regional, national, and internationally renowned hero, Edward H. Bennett. In fact, the Burnham Plan Centennial Committee, the Chicago Architecture Foundation, the Art Institute of Chicago, Great Books Foundation, which is in the back here today selling books, as well as other foundations and institutions, have been presenting programs for the past year about this 100th anniversary milestone involving Burnham and Bennett. Edward H. Bennett, in his design and execution of the Burnham-Bennett Plan, helped define Chicago as a world-class city. It's Bennett's execution of the plan after Burnham dies. It's the execution that is so very important because while it may seem to make no small plans, for they have the power to move men's souls, it's executing the plan that is the key. The execution of this plan is what proves the genius and moves our souls. Bennett left us with a city filled with beautiful Beaux-Arts-styled buildings, parks, and monuments, from the city's smallest bridge tender houses, designing at least 10 of the city's bridges, to the monumental internationally famous Buckingham Fountain, based on the Fountain of Versailles. Ted Bennett III is the grandson of Edward Bennett. He is the third generation of the Bennetts to live in Lake Forest. He will provide a look at the family life of Edward H. Bennett with family photos and history. Art Miller, Lake Forest College's archivist of special collections, will speak on Edward H. Bennett's professional life and accomplishments. After the program, we are going to visit the Edward H. Bennett's house and garden called Bagatelle at Deer Path and Green Bay Road, and I have directions in my hands. Tells where to park. I now welcome Ted Bennett and Art Miller, who have both been presidents of our Lake Forest Preservation Foundation. Ted?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to see you here, especially since about 3 weeks ago I discovered that my calendar was wrong and I had this down for November 15th. So I wouldn't have been here if I hadn't gotten that mailer, so thank you, Marcy, for the mailer. Every story has a beginning, and this one is no exception. First off, you need to know that my grandfather, Edward Herbert Bennett, was just called Bennett by his friends and associates. So if you hear Bennett, it's not me, it's not my dad, it's not some person, but it's Bennett. More into there. All right, we'll work at that. You keep yelling, Paul, and I'll get it straight. I'd like to start by introducing my great-grandfather, Edwin Charles Bennett. Bennett's father, my paternal great-grandfather, Edwin Charles Bennett, born in 1842, left his native Cheltenham, England, and shipped out from Bristol as a cabin boy. He returned by water as a captain, having logged over 1,300,000 nautical miles without an accident, mostly between Bristol and San Francisco, Bristol and China, India, and Australia. He married a French woman from Normandy, Marguerite Julia Callas. We do not know much about her. She did die in San Francisco where they were living and is buried out there. The Thessalus, this was his ship. Art, we'll get this together by the end of the show. And I'll be speaking into this by the end of the show. Great-grandfather brought the entire family around the Horn in a voyage my grandfather always liked to talk about. It must have been quite harrowing. Great-grandfather expected the ship to be backed and sunk and led all of them in a prayer and then went back on deck. Needless to say, ship and passengers all survived. We have a lot of misinformation about my grandfather's early life. Sorry, but that's just how it is sometimes with the history. We know he was born in Cheltenham, England in 1874. I was asked last year if he was an English or British citizen or an American citizen, and I really don't know. So maybe Art knows that, which one he was. I think he may have been British. Anyway, we know he was born in 1874. He played often with a cousin at nearby Stroud at a place called Woodlands, I believe some sort of a resort. He shipped with his father on the clipper ship Thessalus more than once, landing at San Francisco. People have different recollections of what his life was thereafter, and the following version from my father does not match well with records of my grandfather's financial assistance from San Francisco's Phoebe Hearst. She apparently saw his potential and helped with his support in Paris for some time. We do know he told my father that he looked at San Francisco and thought that something should be done for Chicago architecture, American architecture, Bennett worked as a draftsman in San Francisco, then sailed back to England, and in my father's words, for boring work, wound dynamos for a year to save up money for the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He attended the Bristol Technical College and then went to France where he studied architecture. The French were very good to foreigners. If they paid for a year of study and passed the exams, they would be educated free for the rest of their work in Paris. Be that as it may, Bennett was hardly the usual foreigner, as he spoke French fluently, thanks to his mother. Grandfather graduated from the École in 1900, having won the Prix de Rome, and where he had met, among others, Pierce Anderson, who was to become his best friend. It was Anderson, my father's Uncle Dandy, who died young in 1923, who suggested Bennett's name to Daniel Burnham when grandfather was working for George B. Post's office in New York, where he stayed for about a year and a half. Grandfather met Burnham at West Point, where Burnham was preparing for a competition. The two men hit it off beautifully. Burnham immediately asked Bennett to come to Chicago, and grandfather made arrangements with Post, who agreed to let him go. Next slide, please, Art. This is the Chartres Cathedral South or Royal Portal. It was one of the pen and ink drawings that my grandfather did while he was at the École des Beaux-Arts. Little side view here. Recall that he lived in a time when captains of industry actually built businesses, all the time, though sometimes running afoul of the law. Standard Oil of Ohio's Rockefeller and Flagler, also of the Florida East Coast Railroad, the railroad that went to sea. James J. Hill, the empire builder for the Northwest. Dynamic people such as these shaped his professional world. And we had a few of them in Chicago, too. I'd like also to take a minute here to ask you to think of the people he met and may have met while he was in France. Matisse was only 5 years older than Bennett. We know they met, and then he bought 2 of his works from Matisse's agent. Toulouse-Lautrec was 10 years older. We don't know if they met, but he did own one of his drawings. Next slide, please, Art. Do we have another slide there? I'm not sure we have another slide. There we go. With Burnham, Bennett blossomed. He brought his friends Jules Guérin and Ferdinand Janin to Chicago to work on the plan. This was a painting by Janin to Bennett, and it basically says, "To my good friend." By this time, Burnham's health was beginning to fail. Burnham, who had brought so much to Chicago with his vision and salesmanship, had to reduce his schedule. Bennett took on more and more of the plan until he had made it his. Not only did he speak French fluently, he was an avid and accomplished horseman. When he arrived in the Chicago area, he settled in Lake Forest, where he lived at the Onwentsia Club. There he was a much sought-after bachelor, in no small part because of his equine skills and his continental education. In short, he was something of a catch. In 1913, he married Catherine Jones, the daughter of successful lawyer and businessman David Benton Jones. You may know Jones as a subscriber to the plan through his membership in the Commercial Club. Grandfather was trained as an architect, but his plunge into city planning with Burnham set him permanently on that track. He did very little architecture after that, a couple of park recreation houses, of which one was in Ira Bach's Chicago on Foot, his own house, Bagatelle in Lake Forest, the house he owned with my father in New Mexico, at the Ghost Ranch, where he knew the artist whose name I can never remember. Thank you. Georgia O'Keeffe. And the Buckingham Fountain in 1926. Art, there's, I think, 4 slides of the Ghost Ranch here. If we can just zip through those, let everybody see them. Oh, what do we have? Oh, well, whatever. This happens. let's go forward. We'll find out where we are and we'll work with it. And what do we got next? This was, I can't even read it from the thing. Okay, what do we got next, Art? All right, well, skipping ahead, here's somebody that's speaking to you today. I was born at the end of World War II, and my mother unfortunately developed blood poisoning when I was born and had to stay in Washington, D.C. for 6 months. I came back to Chicago with my father, lived next door to Bagatelle, where we're going later on today at the Jones estate. And my grandfather would entertain me by blowing into the beer bottle and making noises. I was an easy one to entertain, apparently. Anyway, he also designed the Michigan Avenue Bridge in 1920 and the beautiful bridge tenders' houses. Excuse me. The rest was planning in the city beautiful mode, which was sometimes built, but more often put on city shelves. Examples of where it was built were Chicago, Denver, Phoenix, Pasadena, and of course the Triangle in Washington. Being chairman of the group of architects, he typically took the worst building for himself. The city beautiful mode was much better than some critics have granted it, but was only recently been recognized. It gave way to what my father called pie chart planning, which he felt was pretty hopeless. Grandfather was, whether he built buildings or not, one of the practitioners of classic architecture. He was constantly occupied during the years from Burnham's death until the 20s, when he took his family on a much-deserved vacation to Europe in 1923. Art's been asking me to bring a camera in to show you one of the cameras he probably had on this trip. This is a little 2.5 by 3.5 Zeiss Icon, which is very likely the camera that my grandfather had with him in Europe. But I can't figure out how to open it, so this is as good as it gets. He was also busy after that until well into the 30s. In 1929, he was elected a fellow of the AIA. Have we got him in Tryon art? Oops. Well, in any case, it's not that important. Rather than going into the meltdown, we're going to take too long. I really did not have an opportunity to know him well, as he died when I was 9 years old. This has been an unfortunate pattern in our family. My father's mother died when he was 9, so we seem to not really get to know our forebears as well as we would like to. I do remember that he had scratchy cheeks from his, 5 o'clock stubble. He was in ill health and spent much of his time in Tryon, North Carolina, enjoying his retirement with his second wife, Olive, whose grandson is here tonight. Put your hand up, Peter. And so say hi to that fellow, too, when you get a chance. He was a doting grandfather, and I have many photos of us from when I was little. As in every story has a beginning, it also has an ending. There's a whole other part which would tell the story of the Jones family, into which Bennett married. Bennett's son became an architect after completing his naval service during the Second World War. Like his father, Bennett Jr. quickly moved into planning. His son, me, did not become an architect, however. My stepbrother, Rick Phillips, did. My younger son, Tim, is the latest architect in the family with a developing practice in Libertyville. Thank you. And now I'll turn you over to Art, who we've all seen before. This is my grandfather there. He's at his meal table at the Ghost Ranch, relaxing with a book, or actually, it looks like he might be drawing on something or writing on something. I see a pencil in his hand. Probably he's doing a puzzle, but in any case. And this, I believe, is the house itself. It went away, unfortunately, out of the family. I have no idea if it's even still standing. I haven't been there. Peter, is it?
Yes, it is.
Oh, my God.
Spent a week there last May. The house is still there. The O'Keefe house is still there.
My God.
They rent it out for religious things. It's all owned by the Presbyterian Church.
Ah, the new Lake Forest Place. Anyway.
That's Tryon, by the way.
Oh, we found the Tryon.
Yep, there
I need a mirror right here. There he is standing in his wall. Tryon was built by a fellow named Schweiker, who was a Chicago architect, for my grandfather, and it's Long Lane. It's now owned by a Lake Forest couple. And if you can track them down, they're there a good part of the year, and you can actually find it in the phone book. Pop in and visit them. Thank you.
So, I'll just say a little bit of history about this whole Bennett project. It first started a year ago in September when Carl Smith, who's written a book about the plan of Chicago, came out and spoke here at Gorton for the organization, for the Preservation Foundation, in the auditorium. I was scheduled the next month, on October 19th, to speak about Edward Bennett. His talk was mostly about the Burnham plan and the whole process that went through, and about Burnham. So I was speaking about Bennett. So I was working on it, and I remembered that in 2002, Ted had, I know, gotten a whole bunch of boxes when his stepmother-in-law had given up the place that his father had lived. Edward Bennett Jr. had remodeled from the old David B. Jones Estates stable, which was 12,000 square feet. And so I called up Ted and asked him if he had anything else to look at. Well, for people who were there last year on October 19th, you saw that we did find quite a few things that Ted still had. And Ted and Marcia made a very gracious donation to Lake Forest College's special collections of a number of photographs. And there is on the Lake Forest College Library Archives site a Bennett explanation and several of the photographs. They're still being processed, but they've changed the real kind of profile of what we know about the plan of Chicago and about Bennett, but about how he affected the whole plan and those who he worked with. And we've sort of figured out kind of maybe what happened. Edward Bennett in 1953 donated a lot of his professional papers from his practice that went from 1910 until 1944, I think it was, to the Art Institute when he retired, in 1953. He died in 1954. Now, 1953 was only about 45 years after the plan had been published, and there was material in it that suggested that there are things that maybe he thought were too personal and it was just too soon after the plan to actually reveal some of the material. So that has added into and actually filled in some of the gaps about what actually was happening in the plan. And Carl Smith's book is very important. Actually, Carl Smith has also written the introduction to the superb Donnelly printed the original plan in 1909, and they reprinted the plan in 2009, and the gentleman in the back is making available copies of that for $40 in paperback and $125 in hardback. But for $40 in paperback, it's just an unbelievably good value. It's very carefully done, beautifully prepared. It has Carl Smith's introduction to the plan also, so it's very up to date and very accessible, a great holiday gift for people you might know, that sort of thing. So I recommend it. Also, and I don't get a commission, but we then had two talks that were given this last spring. In May 26th, for the Burnham Centennial people, Ted and I both spoke at that occasion, which was downtown, not right at the building where Bennett worked, which was the Railway Exchange building, but just north of it at the Cliff Dwellers Club, which is where the Pullman building used to be. I think it's the Inland Steel building, yeah, next to the Orchestra Hall anyway. And you had a view similar to what Burnham would have had from that rooftop over to see what Grant Park would have looked like. And then on June 18th, there was a follow-up lecture, and Ted, you weren't actually at that one, but that is one that this talk is kind of based on more, because what I'm going to be showing are things about one of the big changes in the profile that emerged from the things that we see that came with this project, actually, that one assumption was that a woman did a monograph on Bennett, a biography and an exhibit and things for the Art Institute in 1982. And Edward Bennett Jr. helped a lot, and she gave a talk at the Lake Forest Library that year in November of 1982. Anybody here that was present for that occasion? But it was very good. I think that the conclusion that she drew about Bennett's work, though, on her relatively kind of going through the materials that were available was that he was pretty derivative. He just followed pretty much Edward Bennett's concepts. And followed Daniel Burnham's concepts and just carried them out without adding much new value added to it. And what I think is important and what's emerged, and unfortunately not with us today, is Josh Anderson, a student at Lake Forest College graduating next year, class of 2010, who's done a lot of work on this and actually made some interesting discoveries. And he helps us figure out how really there are three different ways that Bennett moved beyond Burnham, largely because he had to. Times changed, circumstances changed substantially. One was he had to completely reconceive Burnham's idea of Grant Park, and we'll see that. That was a major change. He had to reconceive the whole thing. Second, he had to make a major adjustment in style from classic, really 17th century revival French style to modern style, Art Deco, the modern French style. He did that. And then the third thing was that, and maybe the biggest challenge of all, was that after the November 1917 Russian Revolution, thinking big plans and collectively went out of fashion until about after the McCarthy era. Some of us will be old enough to remember why that might be. Collective plans, 5-year plans, they sounded basically, as a great aunt of mine said, pinko. They sounded pinko. And so there was a great fear of communism and the class warfare that was involved. And so thinking big plans collectively was something that Americans were very concerned about. So those are three things that he responded to, and what I'm going to riffle through these slides to show you is how he responded. Now, first, this is a cover of a book that I was involved in 2003, Classic Country Estates of Lake Forest, and here's a picture of Bennett's house, looking to Bennett's house from the south, looking north toward the house. This is from a 1930s slide taken by the Lake Forest Garden Club and then deposited at the Smithsonian. That's what it looked like then. And so it seemed to epitomize then the relationship between the Lake Forest estates and Chicago, because this has many of the elements of really the Grant Park situation. A wall of a building on one side and then a long vista out from that with a water feature. This is a small water feature. Lake Michigan is a big water feature, but it's still the same concept. Okay, next slide, please. This is a maquette of a sculpture that I think the Bennett family still has. That's by Loyot, who worked on the Buckingham Fountain. Did the sculptures there, but this is of him kind of at the height of his powers, around the age of 50 in the 1920s, when he was working on the Buckingham Fountain in Chicago. I'm wearing my Chicago tie that has the Buckingham Fountain along with the lions and I think the Sears Tower or something here. But it's one of the iconic things of Lake Forest, and so that was really one of the high points of his career. Next slide, please. This is his great patroness, and this is material that's new. This is coming from a book that came out in 1899, a plan for the University of California at Berkeley, sponsored by, it was a contest, an architectural contest, sponsored by the mother of William Randolph Hearst, the famous newspaper guy. This was his mom, and she was not chopped liver either. She was pretty rambunctious and had married an older man who'd been rather successful in the gold fields, I think. And she went about spending that money to develop the University of California and to create an architectural profession in California. Next slide, please. Now, this is the letter. There were two parts to Edward Bennett's experience in Paris. He first went to Paris in around 1895, studied for a couple of years, went to England and was in a firm in London for a couple of years as an intern. And then apparently he'd applied for some contests, won some contests, that sort of thing. But then he applied back to to California through Bernard Maidbeck, who was an important architect in California, to get support so he could finish up his degree. Most people that went to the École de Beaux-Arts did not bother to get the degree. but he was one of the few that did. David Adler, for instance, even though he was there for 5 years, didn't get the degree. Bennett did get the degree. So, but notice the last line of this thing where he's saying he's going to get $40 a month to help him finish his degree. And it says, of course, the understanding is that you will make your home in California. Now, this did not go to the Art Institute, since by that time Edward Bennett had long been living in Lake Forest and also in North Carolina, which is not California. Although the family had a wonderful place in Montecito, Santa Barbara, which Bennett had done in 1916 had done the landscape for, and I'm sure they went there sometime in seasons and things to visit. So he was in California a lot, and we'll see more about that as we go. Okay, but that shows one of the important things about how he got his degree. Now, this is the École in the mid-19th century, what it looked like. Very formal place in a classical building on the left bank of Paris. Next slide. Now, in the period from 1899 about until 1902, he was back in Paris, and this shows a view of Paris just at the end of Napoleon III's empire, before he had kind of an unfortunate little run-in with the Prussian army in eastern France. It kind of ended his career. But there was also a Tuileries Palace that's there, and we know that this picture is before 1870, when the Tuileries had a problem too and was burned down. So when we go to see that famous Tuileries garden, we don't see the Tuileries Palace today. But the Louvre is behind it. But notice all the straight streets behind. As Baron Haussmann redid Paris, the old medieval Paris, by creating angular streets. And this is much the idea behind the Chicago plan of 1909. Next slide, please. Now, this was going on in 1900. This is a World's Fair. You can see the Eiffel Tower from 1889 left over. And on the right, off to the right, at the end of the axis, there would have been the old Trocadero, which was from the 1879 fair. But you can see that the Champ de Mars was all filled with these booths and buildings for that fair. But notice the big spaces and the people moving around in the big pedestrian spaces. We'll see this showing up again later. But Bennett was there at this time. Next slide, please. Now, this is his buddy that was over there also. This is William Pierce Anderson. Pierce Anderson, as he was known as. And he was a student with Bennett over there. And he's the one who, as Ted mentioned, was the guy who suggested to Burnham that he might want to pick up this fellow and that he could have working with him that had worked, that he'd known in Paris as a really good designer. Next slide, please. This is a picture from one of the cameras. I don't know if it's one of these cameras or an earlier one, but it's by Bennett's camera of Burnham at the little cabin built in California at Twin Peaks. Their first big project was a plan for San Francisco, started in 1904. So Bennett went, they built this cabin for him, and then Bennett decided he would go to Manila and design a new capital in Manila and also the summer capital in, I can never pronounce it, it's something like Baño, in the Philippines, and he did that. So he sailed off and left Bennett in charge of the plan for San Francisco. Bennett was back in California. He was living in California, and he did that for a couple of years, working until 1906. They had a little dust up in about April of 1906. The whole thing burned down after an earthquake, and they thought that would help maybe have the plan be implemented, but their main backer of their plan of San Francisco had gotten into political difficulties with some boodlers and things in San Francisco, and so his clout was reduced. So Burnham, the day after he agreed to do the plan of Chicago in 1906, wrote a letter to Bennett and said, "It's time to come home. If they aren't going to do it, we're not going to hang around. We're going to do Chicago." So Bennett came back. Next slide, please. Now, this is another Lake Forester, lived at 550 East Deer Path, built the house that's there. It was later remodeled by Stanley Anderson's firm, but this is Charles Dyer Norton, and he was the life insurance salesman who was in charge of the Merchants Club. And one day when they had finally cobbled together the financing for a plan of Chicago in 1906, he went to visit Burnham at his office on the 14th floor of the Railway Exchange building just south of Orchestra Hall. And he saw Mr. Burnham looking out the window and looking sad. And he said, "Mr. Burnham, what seems to be the matter?" "Oh," he said, "I've just been to my doctor, and he says I have just 3 years to live." And without missing a beat, Norton said, "Mr. Burnham, by the sheer coincidence, I'm asking you to do a 3-year plan. And Burnham laughed and said, okay, it's a deal. Actually, he went on to live 6 years after that, and he finally died in 1912, but it gave him a new burst of life. But Norton was the guy, the main pusher behind that. And the reason we don't remember him very well is he left Chicago in 1909 himself to go into the administration of President William Howard Taft, and he was his chief of staff, except I think that he was more liberal and Taft was more conservative, and pretty soon he was a big banker in New York City, and we know about those New York bankers. Next slide, please. Now this is the picture, this is the frontispiece from that plan that you can buy in the back of the room. This is at the very beginning. It's a view of seeing Chicago in a very large light as the head of a whole region. And this is done by Jules Guérin. Next slide, please. But there had been been a small sketch that had put in there by Bennett that had shown him how to draw that plan. So we know for a fact that he had done that. Now this is again one of his pictures. This is Mr. Burnham again, sitting at a table in the little cottage or cabin built on top of the Railroad Exchange building. The elevator didn't go up there. You had to go up the stairs to this sort of ramshackle building. You can see the drainage pipe or smoke pipe there right behind Burnham. And he's working. Now, it isn't possible to tell if this is actually writing the plan because there are so many cross-outs and everything. The whole plan is up on the Art Institute that Burnham wrote, is up on the Art Institute website because there were so many cross-outs. But it's totally the same pattern of writing. He did some other things, but probably this is him writing the plan. It's in the context of a group of pictures that Bennett took at Christmas time, 1908, when they were getting really into the high gear on the plan. Next slide, please. This shows close-up of this, and you can see the writing. And we've made an effort of going through the plans to try to figure out what he's actually writing. But because it's a pencil plan, lots of cross-outs, we can never be certain about that. But where Bennett had it on his scrapbook page would suggest that it wasn't him writing out a laundry list. Now this is another very rare picture for Chicago. There are no pictures of Chicago architectural draftsmen at work. Here is a picture of draftsmen working up in that plan headquarters, taken again by Bennett, amateur photographer Bennett. The second from the right fellow's name is Fernand Janin. He was a French guy who did a lot of the illustrations. I'm not sure if the fellow who has the same hairdo that I do up there, if he might be Jules Guérin or not, I'm not sure. But Jules Guérin did a lot of the wonderful paintings. Next slide, please. Now this is an interesting picture. This is Bennett on the right. That's Edward Bennett as a young man, and that's Jules, his friend from school, his buddy who'd painted that portrait that we saw earlier, Fernand Janin. And you notice the little hat on the right. That's very significant in the next picture, because if you look at the shadow lower left, you see a man with a Homburg hat, which is Bennett, the photographer, taking a picture of Pierce Anderson and Fernand Janin, two of his buddies from the École that were key players in Burnham's firm. Burnham's main designer was Pierce Anderson. He'd encouraged him to go to the École, and he did little things like the Wrigley Building, the Union train station downtown, the station in Washington, D.C., that sort of thing for Burnham. Wonderful designer. Next slide. Now, 1907, the first spring after the plan got started later in 1906, Bennett, who had all kinds of outdoor experience and things, was English with French background, was invited to join the Inwensia Club as a summer member to live out there in the summertime. He lived on the Union Club. He lived at the Union Club otherwise during the year on Washington Square, just south of the Newberry Library. Some of you may remember it as Bughouse Square, but in an earlier day it was again fashionable, and the Union Club is now gone. But he moved out to the Inwensia Club, and this picture shows how they had kind of bachelor hall upstairs in those. And there's a fourth floor, and you can see the fire escape down there, which kind of tells you why they eventually built a new building, because they couldn't get fire insurance anymore for the place. That's when they finally built the new Inwensia Club. It's no more fire insurance. But he lived there in summer times especially, and rode to the hounds and did the whole 9 yards at Inwensia. after 1907. Next slide, please. And he married Catherine Jones, who I think is the one on the left. Is that right, Ted?
I think so.
Yeah. And her sister, Gwethlyn Jones. Gwethlyn Jones. These are Welsh names, which I'm not expert at. And so they married in 1913. So now at the same time that was going on, he was getting settled out in Lake Forest. They were getting involved in carrying out, as Jan was telling us about, the plan of Chicago. This is what the area along the river, the south side of the Chicago River, looked like. And for Lake Forest architecture aficionados, you'll notice that one of the buildings up there at the top, in the middle kind of, says Kirk, the Kirk firm. That's actually the firm of the soap people that built Vallombrosa and then the Williams House on Illinois Road. That's their business on the river. The river was a very busy industrial place, and it's almost impossible for us to conceive of it, how industrial it was in those days. But you can see here how it's being active, and this is before, obviously, trucks were common. So this is taken around the time of the plan or shortly after. Next slide. And this shows looking down from where kind of the Michigan Avenue Bridge is. This is, again, Burnham. These are all Bennett's pictures with his little trusty camera. This is looking down Michigan Avenue. See how close together it is? Little buildings, little brick streets. This is completely reconceived in the plan and then carried out by 1920. Next slide, please. Now, okay, this is where we're getting into the three major changes that Bennett had to do from what Burnham had thought of. Notice how the park is just kind of a green tabula rasa along there on the lower part. But you can see the names over these pictures in this about 1908 postcard. You can see the Railway Exchange building is just the tall building there on the right. Next to it on the left is the Stratford Hotel. That soon yielded to the Montgomery Ward building. And Montgomery Ward, he was the guy who threw a monkey wrench into Burnham's plans for Grant Park. Said that the lakefront should be forever open and free, recalling earlier legal arrangements. Next slide, please. Now this begins the series of pictures. There are probably 100 of them, where Bennett took them hanging out over the Railway Exchange cornice. And this caused me a great deal of trouble. I went up there. I'm acrophobic. I couldn't even get near the edge. And but then we figured out, someone came and studied these this summer from England, from London, and she was studying bird's eye views of planners. And in talking about it, and Josh Anderson, the student, also talking about this, we kind of figured out that he wouldn't mind hanging out over the Railway Exchange building. It was unlike a clipper ship. It didn't move, you know. The clipper ship would have been going like this, and he was up in those riggings. And so here, this seemed like duck soup to just lean out over a not moving building. So he had a remarkable talent in that way that he could bring to the task of envisioning the park. Here he's looking at how people interacted over in the park. Notice how plain in the lower right it is. There's no development in Grant Park on the right side of the tracks. And notice up at the end, Grant Park ends in kind of with a beach. It's just water after Grant Park over there. The train tracks are going along through the middle of it, and it's pretty much undeveloped, but people are going over for some kind of event. Every time there was a big event with people, he took pictures of it. Next slide, please. Here's another event. See the big tents for some event over there, and kind of racing racing track on the center. Next slide, please. Now this shows how industrial it was up toward the river. Look at how much the rail yards for all the freight cars were on the north part of Grant Park. Tremendous amount of rail cars, and it was really an industrial hub there. Looks more like Waukegan than Chicago to us today. Next slide, please. Now this is a very important picture, and Lake Forest College played a big role in this. They came up with a scheme this last year to develop a virtual Burnham plan, and they would try to figure out what some of these buildings looked like when you three-dimensioned them out from the plan. And here it's showing what Grant Park would have looked like. There's the Santa Fe building in the foreground, if they had actually built Burnham's building that he wanted out there in the middle of the park, and then another one to the south, and one would have been further north. So you can see he had a pretty building-centric view of Grant Park that was going to shape up. But Montgomery Ward led the fight to not have these buildings built at all. So Bennett had to reconceive the entire project of what to do with that space, which was basically just a big, open, empty space. Next slide, please. One of he was, and this is something that Josh found in letters that are on the web from the University of California. Actually, Bennett said that he was not just trying to cover what was going on in France, which was also big buildings like that and things and very elaborate architecture, but he was really going back to a simpler 17th century ideal. This is the view from up toward the orangerie and behind the palace of Versailles, looking west out toward the canal, and with the Fountain of Latona right in front. Notice in the lower left there are some little numbers, squiggles and marks, because the Fountain of Latona was the model for Buckingham Fountain. And they actually just did a mathematical doubling of that to come up with what the numbers were. So this shows them actually thinking about how they're going to make Buckingham Fountain. But more importantly, those trees are creating an optical illusion. If you were directly on line with that fountain looking out there, you'd think that was a big body of water, not a canal. The same ploy is used at Hampton Court. Perhaps Lenotre did that also for William and Mary in the same period, to have that sense of a great space of water. Next slide, please. We have a big body of water, no problem. This is actually a picture in a book that came out as part of the Burnham Centennial, and Lake Forest High School students provided photographs for it. See, this is a Michael Brandorf, Lake Forest High School, Lake Forest, provided this picture of the majestic Lake Michigan, the inland sea. This is what they had to work with. This is why someone who was an outsider, who lived in California, France, England, could come to Chicago and say, "You idiots, look what you've got. You have this wonderful lake." Next slide. Now, he's trying to think about how to frame this view so that your eye will go straight out west toward the lake. And this is a plan of his from 1915 that he sketched that was part of the things that Marcia and Ted gave to the college library archives. And it shows a series of buildings along Randolph Street going east. It shows him filling in where the railroad tracks were with park spaces and roadways. Up at the top of that, where Michigan Avenue is, you can see it going along because there's the bridge kind of jogging across to connect with the old Pine Street up there. You can see that there's a park there for the beginnings of Grant Park, just immediately north of the Art Institute building. And then there was the peristyle at the north end of that. Next slide, please. The peristyle actually got built in the late teens, around 1920, and this is a picture of what it looked like. It was later torn down and then has been replaced later, again, in the new Millennium Park. Next slide. This is a very rare, this was just available in negative form. This is the only picture that I think anybody knows about, and Bennett took it, of what it looked like filling in that space where there was just water beyond Grant Park. If you couldn't do anything in Grant Park, fine. We would create space for the Field Museum just south of Grant Park. How would we get that? See the little hut that's there kind of in the upper left? That was where, below that was where the tunnel from the train tracks that went around the loop went on. They would take the cinders from the coal ash in the loop buildings and carry it out here and dump it. And this was your original shovel-ready project. See all those guys with shovels crawling around on there? There's about a 15-foot gap between the lower part and the upper part, and they're filling in the space where the Field Museum was. And that entrance to the train tracks was still there when they were finally finishing up the Field Museum around 1921. Next slide, please. Now this shows, see the Field Museum. There it is on that infill. And here's a picture also in the lower right. By that time they had filled in kind of the plaza that would be for the entrance to the park from the Congress Expressway or Congress Main Road, which was going to lead from the big civic center that Burnham wanted. That was maybe he only really paid attention to those big buildings kind of. And he wanted a huge civic center out by where Circle Campus is roughly. Never happened. But the Grant Park did happen, and here you can see it getting started in that period. Next slide. By 1927, more Frenchmen were coming back over to help Bennett with his work on Grant Park, And the fellow on the extreme right, next to Edward Bennett, is Marcel Loyot, who did the seahorses in the thing. Lambert, I think, is the fellow with the, I think he's got a cigarette there, sitting on the lower stoop there. Then there's Catherine Jones and her sister again there, sitting next to Edward Bennett, and some other people that are there also. But this is 1927. This is the the Jones house, 500 North 500 North Green Bay Road. And this was really the headquarters for the family, but the new house by that time had been built to the north of that. Next slide, please. Here's Buckingham Fountain in all its glory, and you can see behind the main part of the fountain there the Railway Exchange Building, and just immediately to the left or south is that Montgomery Ward building that went in, which was why Montgomery Ward didn't want to have a bunch of buildings built into the park. And you can see the seahorses down below also. Next slide, please. And here's looking at the park. And see how it's a very formal garden plan? This is more formal than Paris looked like in that period. Paris had more wavy paths in the English manner, but Grant Park was very angular and very 17th century in its. We have to do anything. I've got some more. So next slide, please. Now this shows you, watching all those people, here's a year ago in Grant Park right after the election. And so Bennett had been looking at people, how they would interact in the park. And so 100 years earlier, he was planning for what Grant Park would look like for the election of 2008. His idea of a garden, of a Beaux-Arts garden, included people. People were part of the garden, as we saw from all those photographs that he took. He saw in a democratic garden that people were part of the whole situation, landscape. Next slide. He also worked on Washington. And this particular picture, recently we supplied it to the landscape architect for the Capitol. This was him coming up with a formal 17th century style plan for Washington and for the mall. And you can see the fountains and the very Italianate walls. Next slide. This is something he actually did build. This is the Botanical Garden. This is an early rendering of what it would look like. Notice where the pillars are. You can see the glass for the Botanic Garden behind it there. And this building is still there. The glass has been redone. No surprise. Next slide. This is the Orangerie for Versailles. We're back to Versailles, just like we were for the Fountain of Latona. Next slide. More. Notice the groupings of the way the pillars are grouped together. And notice how the lines go out from the arches above the windows. Next slide. And here's how it actually got built. This is the one side of it. And notice how those same lines are replicated here on the other side. I guess this would be the Capitol side of that building. So it actually got built very much on the model of Versailles. Next slide, please. Now this is back to Buckingham Fountain, but this is in 1933 when they got excited about lots of colored lights. And Bennett had to redo his style. He'd redone things for Grant Park, had gone to this 17th century style, but he had to go to a modern style for this. Starting in the late 20s, they worked on what to do about the 1933-34 Century of Progress Fair. Next slide. This shows the layout as done, I think, by Raymond Hood, the architect from New York. Bennett had something that was more axial originally, but during this whole process, this was like being in a seminar for him, and he completely modernized his ideas about some of the architectural ideas and landscape ideas. Next slide. And he was always pushing other people forward and always in the background. And this is an archetypal picture of all the architects for the Century of Progress, but notice he's in the back, and he's literally got his hands on the back of the other architect. He's pushing him forward. And Bennett is just kind of leading by helping the others. But he's involved with more buildings in the Century of Progress than any other architect. Next slide, please. This is the administration building, which he had a major part in. It's Holabird and Root also. Next slide. Notice the way the lighting changes the effect of that building, but the different side of it. Very Art Deco. Kind of looks a little bit like Buckingham Fountain there, too. Next slide. Now this is an interesting view of the same thing at night, but that shape appears again. The I think Gwethlyn Jones donated the land for the Deer Path School. And Millman, the architect, I think reflects some of this kind of style in that grand central part of Deer Path School in 1950, influenced by these kind of ideas. And we even see this now in the latest addition to the high school, something like that. Next slide. This is the federal building, which Bennett played a major role in. And you see the three-sided kind of towers, and that's actually Lake Point Tower. It's celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. Some of the ideas for that were behind the same as in this building by Bennett. Next slide. Bennett did this one all by himself. This is a dairy building. And for those of you who know Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy, this is the building. This dairy building is very much influenced by that building. In that house that was built around the same time, late 20s, early 30s, outside of Paris, the cars went underneath, and then the living space was above it, and then a roof garden. So he's very much picking up on the latest French architecture in his own building that he does almost exclusively by himself for the Century of Progress. Next slide, please. Now, third thing that he had to react to, the Russian Revolution. You'd think this is a little far-fetched. Why would that make a big difference? But there really was a great deal of make no little plans did not have the same resonance after Lenin and Stalin. It just didn't mean the same thing at all. People didn't think of Burnham, they thought of Joe Stalin. And his little plans included killing millions of people all at once. Next slide. Defensive planning became the watchword. And so Bennett very subtly, very adapted to the changing circumstances. This is downtown Lake Forest. This is a slide provided by Shirley Paddock of downtown Lake Forest. The zoning law of 1929 drew careful lines between estate areas, support neighborhoods, and commercial districts. And those were refined through the 20s. The city of Lake Forest outsourced all of its planning to Bennett's firm throughout the 20s. In 1929, they also did a plan that created the Plan Commission. Bennett was the first chairman of that commission, and a plan for how to deal with subdivisions and create subdivisions. So what we see much of the way Lake Forest developed is the product of Bennett's ideas. Next slide. Defensive again. This is a fascinating story. This comes from the wonderful Griffith, Grant, and Lackey real estate firm archives. Shirley Paddock has been organizing those for them. And this is a group of things from the North Shore Property Owners Association. The Griffith, Grant, and Lackey archives has quite a bit of this, but a little bit of it is at the Art Institute, but not nearly as much as is in the Griffith, Grant, and Lackey papers. This was all the little communities getting together because the Pennsylvania Railroad had a controlling interest in a truck line, and that they were getting to the Illinois Commerce Commission to allow them to have trucks running on Sheridan and Green Bay roads, and to get back and forth between those, they could use the cross streets all up and down the North Shore. This did not sit well with the people who lived in those communities, not surprisingly. And so Bennett is at the top of the list. Next slide, please. Top of the list of the advisory directors. Again, he's just another property owner on Green Bay Road, of course, where his house was. But he was, contributing his planning expertise in a very quiet, non-assertive or self-effacing way almost, but to lead to a good outcome. Next slide, please. This shows more details about how they were really going to mess up the east side of all the east along the lake. It would have been messed up if they had been allowed to make those 4-lane roads with trucks and everything. Next slide. Here's Deer Path and 41. The result was Route 41. These slides are in the spring of 1936, and they're creating the underpass there at Deer Path, or overpass, or whatever. Next slide. And this is looking from the south up at the same thing. So by 1936, a few years after this big push, they were able to come up with an alternative plan. Even though there was a depression on, they could come up with an alternative plan for traffic that didn't involve driving through Lake Forest and Lake Bluff and all the North Shore suburbs. So the planning really preceded the ideas of the Preservation Foundation of working together to protect the good things in the communities. Next slide. Here's that sketch Sorry I didn't get it moved right, but here's the sketch that was for that Bennett did for that wonderful frontispiece for the plan of 1909. Next slide. Okay, now we're into the house, and this is important. This is a twofer or a threefer. This is a sketch from a whole book of sketches about the house Bagatelle. Notice first the stiff angle down Deer Path to the west, how it's descending pretty rapidly there. You don't have any sense of this on the property. And this, along with the Kitty Corner property, the 1928 or 1927 House for the Clows, where the Whedons live, by David Adler. Also, you don't have any sense of the marvelous way that Adler worked with that site. In this case, you don't have a sense of it because really what Bennett does is he terraces the land down the thing, and the house looks south to get the sun, and he's terraced it so that you don't have this sense of being on a slope or being kind of on a ship that's leading to starboard or something. Next slide. Here it shows him envisioning the garden, beginning to envision the garden with a sketch. Next slide. Here's one from the 20s that's looking from the house to the terminus of the view with some trellis work that was there and a statue of Flora, 1926-27. But see, he's got a completely flat basis there where we're looking straight south, and we don't have a sense of it being on a slant at all. Next slide. This is a year ago, looking back, and the picture is almost the same. A previous owner had added a balustrade to the house, and actually, the Bennetts today have some photos that show the house as it originally was configured with the family on them, and maybe they'll show them at the end a little bit. But what it looked like before there were balustrades, there were just flower pots up there. But it doesn't seem to upset things too much. But this house is facing south, and here's the same water feature, still very much working today. So that's a remarkable accomplishment of stewardship by the owners. Next slide. Now the inside, I want to take a look at the stairway here, just to make a point about modern, classic, modern, and how all these things fit together. Already by the teens, people were thinking about more streamlined. We saw earlier the picture of the orangerie, and it had a very elaborate ironwork stairway. Notice how simple this stairway is and angular the balusters are. Next slide, please. And here you can see even better. This is in contrast to the very elaborate Baroque metalwork stairway at Versailles. So modernism was already coming in 1916 when this house was built. Later, he would show more of this when he built a studio off the center of that garden access to the west, down by where Flora was on the south. That's very much in the Art Deco style. Next slide. And here's another picture of Edward Bennett. On his right is the studio that I was just talking about. And you can see how the land there's a terrace above for where the garden is, so there's quite a drop off there. And there's our little Teddy in his in his baby carriage, looking quite happy. And so there the two are. That was it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Art and Ted. Thank you.